folks, I'm Layman Pascal, and my pronouns, as you can see, are I, we, it, and its to show my solidarity with the ongoing utility of old school integral theory. You know, Bruce and I take pride on the integral stage in showcasing all variants of the emerging overlapping communities of multidimensional transformational and developmental change, up to and including skepticism, critiques, and the endless parade of obituary announcements. Are we post-metamodern now? Is the liminal web already dead? Is integral theory a poisoned relic of a best-forgotten past? We don't shy away from these investigations, but we also have an obligation to allow for rebuttals and counter-critiques. So why has the news of Integral's death been wildly exaggerated? Why is the poison chalice not as poisoned as you think? And why, in fact, is everything conventionally believed about Integral, even in the minds of many of our putatively postmodernist friends, possibly completely misguided? Here to tell us is friend of the channel and sworn enemy of the sinister Mark Forman, it's Mark Forman. Hi, Mark.
Hi, Layman. Hi, Bruce. Nice to join you today.
Yeah, great to be here.
So I think a reasonable way to do this will be to talk a little bit about your motive and then go through your 5 points with Bruce and I offering our responses and broaden out to a general discussion. But before we get into that, is there anything you want to say up front, Bruce? And then we'll have Mark sort of introduce where he's coming from on this.
Yeah, I'm really pleased that Mark suggested this to us as a topic. There's been a number of instances in the past where I've been in dialogue and Mark has kind of back-channeled me saying, are you sure you're really fully representing Integral in your responses to the criticisms? And, you know, sometimes I haven't given the fullest or the best response, and I've tried to go back and really give a clear picture, because I think one of the things we'll talk about is if you just look at what's going on online, you probably won't get a really good picture. Mark is a longtime insider to the integral movement and a leader. I've got a long history with it as well. And I definitely agree with him that there's a lot that doesn't show up in these forum spaces that really needs to be acknowledged. So I'm really looking forward to going into this with him together. And before we turned on the record, he also joked about this being a curmudgeonly presentation. And of course, I don't really feel that is, but I've also had exactly the same feeling of that persona arising in me as I've been interacting in especially new metamodern spaces saying, hey, don't you know that this has already happened? And whatever, being the old man who tries to remind them of what happened a decade ago or whatever. But I do think it's actually a really valuable conversation. There's a lot of new movement happening. One thing that I thought was exciting at the recent Integral conference in Sedona was a number of younger metamodernists in attendance there. And they were there with a little bit of skepticism, but being in the event and seeing what's going on, they actually caught some of the spirit of it. And I think developed more appreciation for what's going on in the movement than they had picked up, you know, from their online encounters. So I think this is really a conversation worth having, and I'm looking forward to it.
No, I just noticed an ambiguity about the title. Because Mark said it's this title, Everything You Think You Know About Integral is Wrong with Mark Forman. But you could also read it as Everything You Think You Know About Integral is Wrong with Mark Forman, as if he's the actual holder of these issues. I don't know if that's an intentional ambiguity or Freudian slip, but Mark, why did you write this? Why make this stand? What's been pissing you off that needs to be corrected or counterbalanced?
Well, I think that initial reading is an interesting, we could psychoanalyze that if we wanted to. But I think, you know, the real heart of it is probably the split between online on one hand, Ken Wilber on another hand, and then the sort of what I consider the living, breathing community, which obviously touches in with Ken, overlaps with Ken in a way, but is also at this point somewhat separate from Ken. And yet when I tap into the online space, I often hear the very same criticisms and accusations about the community in particular that I would have heard in 2001 or 2005. I mean, they're almost zombie criticisms in the sense of you cannot kill them. They just go on and on. And as we're moving more now into the days of long podcasts and social media in that format, it struck me that it would be good if someone came out and said, look, the way that some people are looking at this is really not accurate, not grounded in actually knowing and meeting and speaking with the members of the purported integral community. So in some way, it's actually much more grounded of a critique, because it's saying, well, if you haven't actually met these people and you don't know what they're doing and you haven't read any of their work and you couldn't pick them out of a crowd if your life depended on it, in what position are you to judge the community? You're in a very poor position. Whereas, there really have been dozens of integral events, if you include the integral theory conferences, the integral European conferences, all the what used to be called the integral incubators that were run in Boulder, and the integral spiritual experiences that were run here in California. There have been lots of opportunities for most people to come and break bread and actually get a feel of what the community is. And it's not like entering a cult, it's entering a specific group of people. And so I think that motivation to represent that group of people, what they are doing and have been doing, and the work that they've been doing as well, on top of that. So not just their presence, but their production. And then finally, I would say, Ken is soldiering along, and he's still doing very productive work, and he's still on social media, and he's getting views and clicks, and we'll talk a little bit about that. But, no one is promised tomorrow, and certainly no one in Ken's position of health is promised tomorrow. And so one of the things that came out of the Integral conference that just happened in Sedona, and this is really Nomali Pereira led this discussion of what happens next to Integral. Will we have a leadership? How do we propagate the work, basically? And the work being aqual, all quadrants, all levels, all lines, all states, all types, that being the real heart of it. And so this feels like a good time to say something. I think things will change when Ken does pass away. And that's a whole complex discussion unto itself. But it's important for other people to say things about Integral, because at a certain point, he will no longer be there to be the de facto leader, let's say.
Okay. Bruce, do you want to give us the first proposition that Mark's going to address?
Sure. And we were just hearing a little bit about that in what Mark was sharing, but there's an impression, and sometimes people argue, that Integral is really just Wilber. It's Wilber and his books and maybe a small kind of cultish following around him, but it's not really a community. It's just this one lone figure and his work and a cultish following. So how would you respond to that?
So I'll respond, and I'm going to do the response as I wrote it out initially to Bruce and Layman, because I want my language to be specific and not get caught up in hyperbole or frustration, let's say. So I think some of the written answers contain the points. So let's define the actual integral community. At one point, it was largely just Ken and a small group of associates, but this was in 2001 or 2002. But there was never anything like a cult around him, perhaps accepting that he had a very few close assistants over time who supported him in a fairly pervasive way, given his health struggles. And for those who don't know, Ken has had sort of an immune disorder that has really wrecked his health and was wrecking his health back then too. But Wilber never posed as a guru, never formed a guru-disciple community. Most people had other spiritual practices and other spiritual teachers. And Wilber has really been true to his word in this way. He's a pundit or a commentator, not a guru. Ever since then, Integral has distributed itself through a much larger group of people who have actively taken it up in their professional and personal lives and practical applications. I guesstimate the core group is about 750 to 1,000 people all over the world, given that many larger integral events have been routinely attended by about 500 people, and not the same people come each time. And almost all of these folks have strong connections to other big thinkers and knowledge traditions. No one is just a Wilberite. Everybody is grappling with multiple influences, and this is seen as normal and positive. Integral draws a big map, but people visit many, many places on that map, or they juxtapose it with other maps and other theories, and Wilber himself has never said anything against this. He has always emphasized that you need details and domain-specific knowledge to be more fully effective at whatever you do. Ken himself does this, reading, of course, widely across umpteen different fields. In my own case as a therapist, some days I'm an integralist through and through, but other days I'm more of a Jungian or an attachment therapist or a cognitive behavioral therapist, or in a political sense, I'm a disgruntled Democrat or a libertarian or just a post-conventional person or something like that, who bristles at the limitations of conformist thinking. So I switch frames, and so it goes with others.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. I'll just say a few words about what came up for me when I read that. I've always used this distinction between integralists and integralites to point out that there's a difference between knowing the model, whether you embody it or not, and embodying it, whether you know it or not. And one of the things that distinction does is remind me that it's very normal for human beings to gather around a knowledge system or a prominent individual, to learn and affirm, to be fans, to pick up a few things. So there's obviously going to be some superficiality, some hardcore Wilberians, various degrees of believerism mixed in with all the very diverse, sincere, ongoing attempts to understand things more deeply and integrate it with all the other sources in everyone's life. That's what we would expect to find, and I think it's what we do find. I didn't personally ever relate to Wilber as a guru. I don't really know anyone who did. He's an important theorist, a speculative philosopher, a meta-modern elder, and he's done a great service to an emerging movement despite and or because of his human peculiarities. Now, that said, I think it is correct for people to have a healthy suspicion wherever there's a big name or a special terminology or a group that's gathering around something, especially a white male American systematizer who thinks highly of himself. That's a natural caution to have because humans are dumb. We think that people on stages should be paid attention to. We think people we hear about are important. We inherit evolved attention habits that are not particularly interested in truth and well-being. And my opinion is that the people who tend to succumb to those old attention and evaluation habits do so in reciprocal ways. There's a sort of ambivalence there where we're simultaneously vulnerable to cult dynamics, whether anyone's trying to implement them or not. And at the same time, the parts of ourselves that are aggressive against groups and aggressive against big names and the person in the middle, they seem to express the same kinds of tendencies. Anti-cult is a kind of cultism, and a rebel is usually a kind of conformist, in my observation. So whether or not people are reacting positively or negatively around this cult leader, I think there's a frame there that people should inspect in themselves. Not that there aren't real manipulators in the world, but that manipulation works with that uncurious part of ourselves that takes it very seriously for or against. And a healthier mind to me is good-humored and curious and exploring in the service of their own decisions. And to be fair, to try to be as impartial as I can. What I've seen in the integral community, especially in real life, not always online, is that these are sane, good-humored people with far less cultishness than I see in the average family or church or political affiliation.
Yeah, and I would just comment to piggyback on that and say, well, if I were to steelman the question or the accusation, I would say, and this touches into what you said, of course there is a process. In other words, of course, when somebody first discovers something very exciting, a very exciting thinker who, puts out work that can really shift your perspective, of course they are going to show up in a sort of missionary zeal and enthusiasm. Typically they'll be younger. That's just the life course reality. And but that's where they have to start. And the if I were to say it this way, it's like people were paying attention to the beginning of that process, but then seemed to think that either the process stopped or it was not worth continuing on to pay attention. And yet that process continued in all of the people who were sometimes called the integral kids, was the moniker that we all got because we were in our 20s. But yeah, there was a zeal, and today I think it would be just the same. If you were 23 years old discovering Wilber, you'd want to go meet the guy, and that would be a huge experience. But it wouldn't be where you are when you're 43 for most people.
How about you, Bruce?
Yeah, I don't think I have too much to add to that. I would say in being around the community for a long time, I also have almost never encountered cult-like dynamics in any of the concerning sense of the exploitation of others and taking their money and the need to give up your identity and all of those kinds of things. I've never really encountered that at all. I think something that people may be reacting to that I think both of you have touched on is this kind of boundaried thinking and over enthusiasm that can happen. And I think in the embryonic stages of the birth of any culture, there's bound to be some kind of cult-like dynamics in the formation of a culture. And that seems to be actually a necessary step along the way. It is an immature thing and it's something to watch out for, but I think people especially were overly cautious about what was happening and projected a lot onto it, understandably because of some disasters that have happened around guru figures and other things. And we have reason to be cautious and careful, but I never saw anything, like what was behind a number of the accusations. So I really fully agree with what both of you have shared. So if there's nothing else you want to add, I'll go on to the next main question.
Yeah, I would just to triple down, I would say people in integral come and go as they please. There's no enforcement of conformity. It's, like as you were mentioning towards the beginning, Bruce, some of the younger folks from the meta-modern movement hopped into the conference, had their own experience. No one is going to, let's say, police them or, push them to come back if they don't want to come back, if there's another integral conference. So it really doesn't have that dynamic. The only thing that might have some of that dynamic is, again, Ken has caretakers who he really needs because his health is terrible. And I think some people might have gotten those people confused for just about everybody else. And I'm not saying he runs a cult of caretakers, but there was more, there was an inner circle around how do we help this man, function as best he can given his limitations. So that's all I would add.
The other common criticism that we hear is that integralists are overly intellectual, disembodied eggheads, stuck in theory, out of touch with their larger somatic beings. So how would you respond to that?
Yes, this is blatantly wrong. Capitals on all the letters of wrong. Every integral person I have ever met practices growth practices. As cross-training practices was a major message of Ken's for the first several decades of his career. People meditate, they do circling, they take psychedelics, they do psychotherapy, they do yoga or tai chi, martial arts, do sweat lodges, soul retrievals, energy healing. Just about any practice under the sun has been explored and is cross-trained by integrals. Everyone does something physical as well and specifically. And many integral people are notably very lively. They're compulsive huggers. They're very animated. They enjoy dancing. There's always a dance portion of every integral event I think I've ever been to, or any of the conferences, let's say, and even just some smaller meetings with a group called Bay Area Integral, which was Terry Patton's group. And there's only a small fraction of people in integral that can actually engage the theory largely at the intellectual level of critical meta-theorizing. So people imagine it's a bunch of people, I don't know, with inflated heads talking about the theory, but there's really just a small group of people, I would say it's less than 20, who are able to grapple with the theory for the theory's sake. And in other words, critique Aquil, modify Aquil, offer alternatives to Aquil as a framework. And even these people are constantly also practicing and doing embodied practices. So I've heard this criticism a million times, but it's just a matter of, if you do those embodied practices, it's going to show up in your being. And when you're in a community of integral people, you feel that they are embodied, they are in touch with their emotions, they are there as human beings, and they are not simply theory hounds. And I would compare it favorably to any other spiritual community I've seen in terms of just people being lively and often very grounded. So that's what I would say about that it's just not correct.
First of all, egghead is a great word. It's got a kind of 1950s Archie comics feel to it. I wouldn't have believed anybody still used it, but I ran into a border guard a couple of years ago who was telling me that the pattern they were using to pull people out of their cars for extra inspection was implemented by those eggheads in Washington. That's amazing to me that people still use this terminology. It's really charming. The intellectual thing, that's very intriguing. Like, people are triggered by the witchcraft of abstractions. Like, general humans are stuck in their heads. They're thinking too much. And even if they despise academics and abstraction and imagine themselves to be the folksy salt of the earth, they're overdriving their intellectual circuitry a lot of the time unnecessarily. And I think it's important to me always to realize that the amount of useless mental self-absorption is not related specifically to the type of content that's being thought about. If I spend an hour ignoring my relationships in my body thinking about physics, and someone else spends 3 hours doing the same thing thinking about the girls at the typing pool or whether their cousin's a communist, they're the intellectual. They're overdriving the intellect. They're just not any good at it. So big picture and big history thinking are not specifically intellectual, but they are rare. they surface a domain that seems opaque and therefore potentially dangerous and deviant to a lot of people. So I get that. If you hear significant sounding words whose meanings are not visceral to you, it seems like a weird, hollow abstraction. But generally, I would say I agree with Mark here. Most integral folks are specifically doing their abstract thinking in ways that try to keep thought moving back to feelings and relationship and bodies and play and practicalities. The integration model itself is supposed to lead our thinking to these domains. Does it always succeed? Of course not. Is there a risk of failing to really connect with the world by protecting ourselves, by thinking that we're integrating everything? Of course there is. But who knows those risks better than the people who are actually encountering it, actually thinking about it, and explicitly valuing balance in their approaches to life? So to me, these are the people who should be the least subject to the accusation of over-intellectualization in a way. They're the ones who are directly trying to address that specific problem.
Yeah, so I would just add a few things that nicely flow from what you just said. Integral is unique, particularly, and again, I'm going back to this meaning of when you get a group of people who identify with integral in some way, is very unique in that people don't suppress their intellects. So you can be as smart as you want to be. There's no cultural, let's say, penalty for showing off your cleverness. If you've got it, great. I mean, ask the hardest question you can ask. And in there, that's a nice feature of the integral community, because that's definitely not true. It often frustrates people in other settings when somebody asks a question that's too clever by half. And at the same time, integral, because it has this practice dimension, also suggests you work on an aspect of yourself that is moving away from the intellectualization of anything. In integral lingo, we'd probably call that being aware of constructs. So your mind, your ego is constantly constructing things, and at a certain stage of development, you become aware of that. Now, it doesn't mean you stop using your intellect altogether. That's not the idea either. But it does mean that your identity shifts so that the intellect isn't the center point. And I've heard Ken himself talk about that this was a difficult transition for him. Can't remember, maybe possibly it was in One Taste that he talked about sort of disidentifying from his intellect towards his, I guess he would say, spirit or self or Buddha nature, etc. So integral encourages both things, and that's unusual because you then meet people who, if they've progressed in that way, are more playful, more sort of, they're more playful people, because it's the intellectual part is something that they can toss around like a ball, and it's fun, and it doesn't have to be deadly serious for it to also mean something. So I would say there's sort of a high end in there where it's sort of intellect plus that you really get to see and get to participate in as well.
I agree with really all of that. This comes up for me a lot in my teaching, especially. I'm, teaching in environments where there are a lot of people who you could say are often coming in with more new age and green sensibilities and sensitivities. And so there's a strong emphasis on embodiment and a distrust of intellect among a number of, the incoming students. And so that's always something that I have to explore around presenting integral content, is that. And often what I've found is people who, when they hear some kind of presentation of integral spiritual or philosophical perspective, and they claim that it's disembodied, It could be, depending on who's presenting it, but many times in my own experience, when something strikes you as disembodied, it's because you haven't found a place for it somatically. You haven't found a place phenomenologically for it in your own experience. Therefore, it lands with you as this flat, heady abstraction, whereas it could be coming from a place that's actually deeply rooted in, rich multi-perspectival experience and feeling and perception. And so I find that that's often the case. And I try to encourage the students to just open up a horizon and say, okay, it may not land right now, but it could be something that you could feel into. And let's explore how you can feel into that. And similarly, something like Henrik Skolimowski talking about intellect or objectivity actually being a kind of yogic practice. It's a particular way to unify with an object. It's not through the body, but it's still an embodied practice. It's like Sloterdijk, also talking about the philosopher, has a practice of a temporary bracketing of reality in order to do a rich tunneling into some aspect of being. And that's welcome as a practice, as a way of being in an integral space. And so I really resonate with what you said about the intellect plus, Mark. I think that's what it is. It's like, it's not a hyperindulgence in intellect or, a flight into, embodied, experience and only, non-grounded spiritual realities. It's a welcoming of all of that. And I think those cases where we find it really super heady and abstract is often what we were talking about in the first question, where there were some newly enthusiastic people who just want to use the categories and slap them on everything, and everything has to run through that lens for a while. But that's actually a process of learning how to embody it, right? So again, it's shallow. It's a little bit of immature expression of it. I would say definitely not in the overall rich, mature expressions of integral. Is it that way at all? There's a deep celebration of working in the world and with all of our capacities.
Yes, and I think that's a terrific way to frame it, that you need to find a place in your body for it. And when you do, strangely enough, these categories, which aren't that complicated on paper. In other words, you can describe most of integral to a high school student of average or above capacity, let's say, and they can grasp certain portions of it, which is not true of some other philosophical approaches. But if you do work with the concepts, they do begin to feel much more intimate. So when I go through the 4 quadrants, I'm having a felt experience in myself of the contents of each of the quadrants. And it's a very rich thing. And that's only emerged with time. It didn't take 1 year. It probably took more like 4 or 5 years, but it also didn't take 25 years. It isn't a rarefied state that you can only do with a lifetime. It's more like, no, you work with some concepts and they become very natural to you. And, 4 or 5 years is a good arc for learning some conceptual system. And a lot of other conceptual systems are similar. In therapy, we have to learn many, and they all take some time before you start to see them in people and go, oh, this is what the cognitive behavioral therapists are saying. So I just like that idea of process and allowing the concepts to become somatic. And if you don't want to, that's fine. Don't feel you have to, but it would be good to also know that you are limiting that particular development that other people might have. If I read about Christianity, but I don't go to church and I don't do centering prayer and I, don't do the Eucharist and all of that, my ability to understand Christianity is going to be stunted. And of course, I'm someone else's who does all of those things or more. is going to develop a much deeper relationship with the doctrine of the Trinity or the person of Christ or whoever. And as an outsider and an integralist, I can try to appreciate that, but I'm in a tough position to just judge Christians are blank based on my outsider's perspective.
One of the other criticisms that often comes up is that it's related in part to what we were just talking about, that integralists tend to be absorbed in theory and in spiritual practice, and they're not really grounded in reality in terms of the demands and the needs of our political and other situations, so that they don't care about politics. So what's your impression of that critique?
Yes. So here's what I wrote in response to that, which is maybe the most common criticism. All of these are classic kind of criticisms you still hear, but this one might even be singled out. So this might have been true early in the movement, say in the late 90s and early aughts. In other words, that Integral didn't have anything to say about politics. But that criticism was so withering at the time. In other words, it was coming constantly, it was being offered constantly, talked about it, that people in the integral community eventually became concerned with the political implications of the theory. This does not mean that Integral is full of people with activist mindsets necessarily. That isn't true, though there are some. But as informed citizens, I would place a group of Integral persons up against the political knowledge set of literally any other spiritual community in the Western world, even socially concerned Buddhist communities, which is to say Integral people are very bright. It's sort of the bar for entry into the community. And I'm not even talking about this small group of theory capable folks. I'm just talking about the average Integral person, and that they know about politics, both practically and as a context for social values, much more than your average American citizen. Now, whether that meets your particular bar, I don't know, but I think it's a pretty good bar to say that Integral people are politically informed, and there have been many, many political discussions, presentations, panel discussions for probably about the last 15 to 20 years at these events, particularly starting, I think, with the Iraq War, started a set of criticisms because Wilber, for the record, did not endorse the war. He endorsed the idea that you could be for it or you could be against it, and that was tied to some developmental issues. That's essentially what he said. But commencing around then is when I remember the political discussions really heating up, and I expect it's going to remain a topic at Integral gatherings for the forever future. It's one that shouldn't go away and isn't going away, but it's so much more present than it initially was. So this is one where actually I think the early criticism is correct. It's just not correct at 2 decades later, is what I would argue.
Yeah, I would agree with that, but I think there's a kind of a virtue in the pressure of the ongoing criticism, right? There's a real issue here, but it's not one that applies specially to integral theory. Like, we're obviously, as a species, as a culture, suffering from inherited low-grade game A nonsense encoded in our customs and the accelerating background effects of modernity's successes and the insipid counterproductive versions of false progressivism and neo-traditionalism that claim they're critiquing the problem but are actually undermining our strengths and rotating us back to a pre-modern disaster. So there's this situation compounded and amplified by a massively potent set of new technologies that requires urgency, requires a coherent transformative response. It's got to involve something like socioeconomic and political mobilization to restructure incentives and change the assumptions of business as usual. And that's real politics. When I sit down with smart, deep, integral leftists or meta-progressives or some of the interesting shoots of integral conservatism, I think they're right. There's this internal critique within integralism. We need to be farming intelligently. We need better unions, better churches to empower individual autonomy in the face of excessive liberal regulation. We need voting reform. We need cooperatives to replace corporations. We've got to prevent fascism and their centrist enablers from ignoring the scale and tempo of the problems we're facing. There's a real moral urgency here. But this is not just about integral. This is about everyone. This critique applies to all institutions, all groups, all cultures at the moment. And the idea that integral should be taking it more seriously, I think we should be constantly responsive to that, because many people would like to see people with integral consciousness taking more of a leadership position on this somehow, even though we don't know exactly how to do that.
Yes, and I would say, I agree with you. I would say, at least on the integral front, I don't think people saw the problems of globalization coming the way that they have landed now and the reaction against. And I certainly don't think anybody, Ken included, was tuned into the internet and what that would unleash, both some to the good, but quite a lot to the negative. But yeah, we are struggling in the same sea that everybody is struggling in. And yet there have been a few people, probably most notably Terry Patton, and who passed away about a year ago, and then also Steve McIntosh, who are developing integral responses to political situations. Steve now being probably the most identifiable person. And it's quite possible that Steve could be incorrect in his applications of integral politics. So it's not necessarily an endorsement of his work, other than to say he's working on it. And he comes out of, largely he's coming from an integral sort of base of knowledge, and the people around him are integrally informed, who are helping him move this forward. And so he'd just be a good example of going back to Ken is not the only one. People have been doing the work in their own domains. Integral is coming up with answers and responses. Are they correct? We're going to have to find out. And it is the most complex project of probably any, I think, to design good political systems, let's say good socioeconomic systems that both produce abundance but also lower inequality. I mean, that is the goal at the end of the rainbow, and I see us as a part of trying to help do that. But it's not going to be done alone. It's going to have to be some kind of consensus with a lot of people having buy-in, not simply integral people.
I've definitely observed a growing integral consciousness around politics. I think within the community, it's tended to remain somewhat divided. I know that there was the beginning of some impact politically around the, Clinton and Bush era. Some politicians and leaders were reading integral thought at that time. I don't really have that much to add here. I agree with what all of you have said. One thing I would say is sometimes it seems to me some of the criticism of integral is that it hasn't seemed to be able to really transcend the culture wars in a way that people, I think, would hope that integral would transcend that and that it would deliver more concretely real solutions to it. I think there's really some innovative thinking going on, and I could name some people. I won't, but I think there's some really good thinking and pushing in different directions going on. But yeah, I think part of that is that part of the criticism may be that integral should be able to do more, and why don't you have a more articulate and developed platform to hand to the world, to really to put into practice somewhere.
Yes, I mean, there are people doing, I would say that Steve McIntosh has offered up real solutions. Greg Thomas, who some of the audience might know, who's working in particular on, a type of what you might call post-racialization. So what comes after if we don't put these people into boxes, put everybody into a racial box? What comes after that? So he's offering an actual solution to the problem of race by transcending it in a particular way and replacing it with culture. So you can identify with your culture, and that's a good identification. Identification with race is not. So, but yes, I think these are some of the hardest questions, sometimes because the answers sound like they are too simple. But, I heard Ken comment on this, when Roe versus Wade was overturned, I thought, oh boy, this is not good, because in some way, Roe versus Wade was an integral proposition. You could get an abortion if you decided to, or you needed to for medical necessity, and you had that freedom. You also had the freedom not to get an abortion, or to, let's say, dissuade people in your life from getting an abortion, so you could have influence in your own sphere. And it ended up being a both and. And so I think, the way I see it, that was a little integral solution sticking out there for a long time. And now we're going to have to balance it in a new way, try to find a new integral solution. And then, obviously that's going to have to do something with the balancing of states' rights with federal mandates or constitutional interpretations and such. But yes, sometimes the integral solution is really just a both and of positions that we already know. But I think sometimes people are looking for truly novel solutions, and some of them are being offered. It's a very difficult thing, but it's not for lack of trying, I think, is the point I'm trying to get across.
Yeah, I think a lot of that will depend on onboarding people who have specific skill sets in various areas. So the work I was doing with the Reconstitution Project is putting forward some interesting ideas, but it wouldn't have happened unless there was somebody who is integrally informed and also understands jurisprudence, and somebody who comes in and who also has a good sense of how ideologies function. So there are a lot of domains in which you have to have somebody from those domains in order to get going there. And so that's an ongoing process.
Yes, it takes that. You can't just learn integral and then unleash it on the world. You have to have domain-specific understanding of something then learn integral, then if you're so motivated, that learn how integral applies in the work that you do or the world that you inhabit. So yes, indeed.
That gets at a familiar rookie mistake with integral, which is that if you've learned the map that has a way to situate everything, therefore you have something to say about everything. And that's very often not the case. So one of the things that people also have a relatively recent charge, especially with the what sometimes called the integral diaspora or with metamodernism, is that integral as a movement really hasn't made an impact on the world. It had a flash. It grew for a little while in some interest. It never had a really full breakthrough, but it had a peak for a while, and now it's fizzled out, and basically it's failed. And as even Nomali kind of mentioned within her presentation at the Sedona Integral Conference, some have felt like the integral boat has sailed, the ship has sailed. So how would you answer that charge?
So first, I would say, integral, as Nomali was pointing out, has become more decentralized, and I'll address that in a second. But I think people mistook the decentralization and the energy of decentralization, which is a sort of the energy is dissipating into multiple directions or being spread out. Whereas prior, it's sort of like as compacted and bright, but in one spot. And that would be Ken, and that would be Ken up until the early to mid aughts would be the compacted energy. And then as other people began to take it up, and as Ken also stepped back in his productivity, the energy dispersed, and people felt that was an ending, but it was actually a whole new beginning. So that's my preface to these comments. So early in the 2000s, no one knew how to apply integral, not even Ken. .com money was promised to the Integral Institute, which Ken had founded, and one plan that was floated was to hold contests to pay a person, I believe it was $25,000, who could write the best book on integral politics, integral business, integral psychotherapy, and so on. That money evaporated when the .com bubble burst, but the quest for practical application did not. In fact, what you had was Ken, and then mostly a large cadre of 20-something grad students who were just getting into their careers. Now, some people dropped out of integral and felt disaffected by what happened with the Integral Institute, but many then headed out to try to make the theory stick in their particular domains. There are now literally dozens of books, and I found 53, which I will talk about. And then there are many more people with wisdom from the road of all manner of integral topics and applications, in addition to those 53 books. I should say with the 53 books, these are not written by Ken, except one is co-authored, the Integral Practice book. These are books written by other people using Ken's theory, applying it in a real domain. And these are serious books, and they're all on Amazon, and you can get them, etc. So there was this generation of integral kids now in their 40s and 50s who have been pretty successful in their careers and have brought integral along with them. I sometimes like to mention, I won't name names, but the head of executive development for Google for quite some time was an integral. So there are integral people moving in and out of some pretty rare spaces. And then, of course, the older generation, the boomer generation, Kens, also took and incorporated the work and made a lot of great strides in what they were doing. I would say this, though, is where the integral community is most poorly represented online, despite the efforts of some people to make integral happen in online forums. I believe this is more a failing of social media and its structure than integral per se, as I've seen numerous other topic communities devolve into constant fighting and insults, etc. Has integral taken over the world? No, but it's a huge mistake to assume that it is not spread and not made significant inroads in many domains. Whether integral itself becomes the zeitgeist or whether it's co-opted and incorporated by a meta-modern movement remains to be seen. But calling it a failure is simply deeply informed about the people, the books, the applications, and so on. Also, as a point of comparison, we're still working on instilling Western Enlightenment values, those rational, reasonable values in the culture, and it's around 250 years later after they were first articulated. So if integral is 1995 and we're in 2020, I'll call it 2023, that's 28 years. And that's not very long at all for an intellectual movement to gain some momentum. So let me just mention this, because I think this is it. A couple things are important to say as sort of at the close of this. First of all, Wilber is still around and he is still pretty popular. I looked up his videos on Rebel Wisdom, which many people who are going to listen to this show will be familiar with. His 4 videos on Rebel Wisdom have a combined views of 432,000 clicks, views. So Wilber himself is still gaining a lot of attention. His books, as far as I know, still sell very well, especially considering the genre. So it's not like he's dropped off the planet and people have stopped listening. The internet is more crowded with content than ever, but he still seems to be getting attention. But there are, of the 54 books, 4 on politics, 4 on religious traditions like integral Christianity, 3 on addiction recovery, 7 on meditation like integral Vipassana and other mindful spiritual practices, 3 on health and healing, 1 on psychedelics, 1 on the integral Enneagram, 2 on ecology or environmental studies, 1 on musicology, 5 books on sexuality and relationships, 3 books on conflict resolution and mediation, 6 books in business, leadership, or organization. And of those 6, I might want to point out Reinventing Organizations by Frederick Laloux, which I believe is the most successful book about integral not authored by Ken. It has something like 1,000 or 983 Amazon reviews. And since very few people who buy books actually review them, it's a successful book. And there's what they call the teal community or something like that has sprung up around his work. But he's really applying spiral dynamics / integral to the business world in a very straightforward way. There's 1 on money and investing, 2 books on education, 7 on psychotherapy. 1 of those is mine. And then 4, one of these is you were involved in, Bruce, on philosophy, just theory, working with theory, working particularly with Roy Bhaskaar's theory as well. So there is just a whole generation of knowledge that has sought out to apply this. And it's so frustrating for me when people reduce integral to, again, just Ken's writing or assume that nothing has been applied. And my concern is the metamodernists are just going to reinvent the wheel without even looking at this material, and it's going to be a total waste of energy. Whereas if they could look at this material in their domains, then they could critique or build upon or take some things with them, because I think, a lot of this material is really good. Gilles Harada wrote a book called The Missing Myth, which applies integral to gay and lesbian studies and is probably one of the best social psychology books I've ever read. And it's sitting there. It has 29 5-stars on Amazon, but in some ways, it deserves a bigger audience. So there are some real gems in this list of books. So that's what I would say about this. Is saying nothing, by the way, about white papers, academic papers, dissertations. I didn't even try. I don't have the search capacities to do it, but my guess would be that there are dozens and dozens of dissertations at this point that also apply integral and that have not been turned into books.
There's a couple of things that come up for me there. First of all, I love the shout out to Lalu and Teal organizations. I think the convergence of new organizational models with adult developmental theory is going to be huge. I was just reading Eric Reynolds' dissertation on this very thing. Second of all, the time frame thing is always a weird issue. I go to Christianity in my mind, and whether we think it's dated from Jesus or the Gnostic Simon Magus or some propaganda effort of Paul Josephus and Vespasian, whatever it is, 200 years in, you would have said this is a fringe movement and a failure, right? So you have to give it time to do its thing. But at the same time, we have big problems, and we have to think about how we can move faster on a lot of these things and not let ourselves off the hook because it's been a short period of time. I think we need a more incorporative mentality. To me, it's important that the integral diaspora is integral, right? You don't have to identify with the brand to be part of the movement or the culture. We do need standards to decide who's in, but these overlapping emergent communities contain a lot of people who we would functionally identify as integral. And the other thing you mentioned there, which is the online thing, is a huge problem. When I was a moderator at Integral Life, we kept running into this issue that the very structure of the forums we were using privileged the people who posted the most and the fastest. So recency and frequency were being privileged. And that's just one example of the layout of the platforms creating atmospheres that don't do justice to what integral thinking is trying to accomplish. So we've got to be really kind of voraciously interested in experimental new platforms so we can find ones that more adequately represent what we're trying to do.
Yes, and I would pick up the idea of connecting and collaborating, and integral has done that. So and not done that in a final way, but has taken those steps, and Sean Esbjorn Hargens is probably the most well-known name there, who facilitated dialogue with Roy Bhaskaar's critical realism philosophical community, for example. We're having now, as Bruce mentioned, a bit more of contact with the metamodern movement, and we need to continue to do all of that. I think, if anything, we need to do two things at once. One, we need to re-centralize to some degree so that we can help people identify, well, what is this integral movement? If it's not Ken, who is it, etc. And that's part of what Nomali was saying at the conference. So we need to be able to do that, and we need to be able to connect with other, if not like-minded, approaches of similar complexity that are seeing some of the same wicked problems that integrals are seeing in the world or in people as well, not just in the world. And we need to be having both of those things go on. So a sort of steel manning of ourselves, I would say, and then a collaborative attitude. And I trust we can do that because I think it's in the spirit of Integral. And, if you read Ken, Ken, especially in his earlier writings, was spending chapters talking about other people's work. He would, take a whole section and talk about Ramana Maharshi's approach to Advaita as representative of a particular stage of development, at least in that particular book. But Ken is the ultimate, gatherer, synthetic philosopher. He'll take from anybody where he feels like a concept is good. And so I think it builds in a little heterogeneity into Integral itself, because you can also, your freedom is to borrow, emulate, copy, steal, try not to steal anything you think is important. And I think when you get into these cross-community dialogues, you get concepts and emphases that are important. So I would argue, if anybody said Integral is totally insular, doesn't help, doesn't reach out, I would say that's wrong. But if someone said Integral needs to continue to reach out, connect, collaborate, I would say absolutely we do. That's part of our mission.
I think I'd add a couple things to that. One, in the early 2000s, there were a lot of movements being generated out of Boulder and out of the Integral Institute. There was the Integral Multiplex and the Integral University, and a number of things that were trying to get launched that never really happened. The Integral Spiritual Center, those things all collapsed. But a lot of people may not remember or don't even know that not only was Ken suffering from his chronic illness, but at one point, really when he was just about reaching his peak, he had a whole series of grand mal seizures that almost killed him and really, really debilitated him for a while. So that actually threw off the momentum that was there quite significantly, I think. There were other issues around leadership and coordination and actually building an organization. That not everything was handled the best way because I think people were learning what to do. But I think that's a big factor that happened was those seizures that almost killed him really deeply impacted the momentum that was gathering and I think is part of what's behind the overall Integral diaspora. People thought, we can't really put all our eggs here. We've got to be able to do our own things and let's do what we can in our own circles. Looking around at, where it has impacted, I think it's pretty impressive. I've been in debates with people who've argued that Integral isn't doing anything. It isn't known. It's unknown, but mostly what they're looking at is what shows up on YouTube or what shows up in forums. And they don't even count all of those other areas where it's actually happening, which is mostly on the ground, or as you mentioned, in books and white papers and dissertations, in classes. I think there's more than a dozen universities teaching some kind of integral content, for sure. Integral's been applied in education and in medicine, in psychotherapy and psychology, in philosophy, in meta theory, in organizational studies, in different religious spheres and theology. I know of people who are doing ongoing integral classes with bishops and nuns in the Vatican. So this kind of work is going on very, very broadly, and it's not in the forefront of public awareness, even in our integral circle. So I think that's a failing in part on our part. All of the corners of integral movement actually are not communicating very well with each other. And we're also not, I think, showcasing enough all of the work that's being done. And I think a lot more could be done to facilitate that and to amplify that. One last little piece I will throw in, which is relating to the meta-modern piece. I was just talking with Damiano Ramazzotti, Italian integralist and entrepreneur, and he's just getting ready to post something on integral and metamodernism. But I just wanted to share one thing that he was observing, which is that metamodernism overall is more of a cultural movement than a model. And it's growing out of observations of things that were already happening in the culture, kind of postmodern movements. Whereas integral started out as a series, a meta theory and a model. And so that's already where it differs. And one of the things is because integral is a model or a map, and there's been an emerging community, but as a model or a map, people all up and down the spiral have picked it up and applied it in their own ways. Not everyone most very successfully. Sometimes some of the disasters that people are looking at are growing out of multi-stage conflicts between multi-stage applications of the theory and sometimes inadequate applications of the theory. So that just gives a different picture. It kind of skews perception. If you're just trying to look at it as a cultural movement, it's more than that. So anyway.
Yeah, and I would say, and at some point, the cultural movement is going to need some way of identifying itself or talking about itself. So postmodernism is not probably a totally cohesive worldview. There are many different authors, etc. But, you could boil it down to like language is constitutive of reality. We use language imbued with political power to decide on what we believe or what is acceptable and so on. And people who are oppressed relative to that language/power relationship need to become activists in order to liberate themselves, essentially. So postmodernism might wrap up into a bubble like that. I would say the metamodern movement is going to need to wrap up into a bubble, and the integral bubble is a pretty easy to explain bubble. Okay, you've got objective and subjective, individual and collective. Those are your four main things, and this gets into the next question. But before we leave it, I just want to say, I think you're absolutely right that when Ken had those seizures and got very, very ill, that was a big moment. The financial crisis was a very big moment too, because integral was starting to really get off the ground in schools, and there were some programs, and in the fallout of the financial crisis of 2008, 2007, some things got more difficult. And I just think trying new things, getting money, etc., got harder. I think Trump, and these are outside the community, but I think Trump's presence disrupted everything for a long time. And then we had the pandemic. So it's been a very rocky, or so it seems to me, rocky couple of decades, and it doesn't help when you're trying to create something with a sturdy foundation. Now, ultimately, everybody's in that position, and we have to do better. But I certainly have seen like, if we had 4 years of a very boring Hillary Clinton presidency, maybe those would have been 4 years which integral would have done more, etc. So just to throw that historical thing aside.
Unless Hillary started a war.
She could have also started a war.
Let me just, before Bruce goes to the fifth prompt, let me throw two things in on this stuff. One is, I think there needs to be an attitudinal change in integral, but also in the world generally, that rockiness is okay. That's how the world is. It's not a failure that we try a bunch of things and they didn't come to fruition. That's a sign of success, a sign of an anti-fragile mindset. We don't know what's going to work or what's going to hit. We've got to be trying lots of things all the time. And that's what success consists of. The other part that stood out for me is that there's a lot of room for specialization. And sometimes diplomatically, I try to say integral is comprehensive psycho-spiritual metamodernism, and metamodernism is narrow sociological aesthetic integralism, right? And that's a way to try to build alliances and to say that not everybody has to have the same emphases. People can specialize in different things. Sometimes it's a big picture, sometimes it's a specific project, and there's room for all of those functions within a cultural movement.
Mm-hmm. I would fully agree with that. I think you need people at all levels, at all ranges, contributing whatever their passion is, let's say, for these issues, and whether they identify as metamodern or Nordic or integral or game B, that's of less consequence.
I feel the same about that. In fact, I'm happy to see these multiple different flowerings. So when I've given any kind of pushback, especially against game B or metamodernism, it's not that they're doing their own thing. I welcome that. In fact, I want to see them doing something that's even more original and unique than we can already find in integral. I would love that. My concern has been more about something that you shared, which is that there's a kind of concern that there's a wealth of things that have already been done, that it's no reason to reinvent all of that. It's no reason to unquestionably carry it all forward, but it should be known about. And I would be more satisfied to see people recognizing the work that's there, engaging with it, and then doing whatever they want to do, rather than thinking that hasn't happened, it existing in a little black box somewhere, and it all kind of getting reinvented again. Is just kind of frustrating to watch.
Yeah. And there may be a role, and then we should probably get to the last question, but there may be a role for, I would say, better media. So Corey DeVos, who works at Integral Life, just released a free video on hold-ons, on hold-on theory. I won't go into hold-ons now, but really well done, really well put together, would stand up with some other YouTube channels which have good production value and clear writing. And I think if Integral can produce that kind of media, it would very much help, because what's out there now is not necessarily of the highest quality in the media video space. So I think there's an opening there, and there's no doubt that that's where the future of communication and ideas lies. Although you guys are doing a version of it because the podcast has also become central to the dissemination of ideas. So Bruce, should we get to the last one? Because I'm still concerned we'll get cut off.
Sure. Yeah. No, I have that one on hand right here. So a lot of integral people are criticized for just applying stages to everything. And people say that that's basically all integral is everyone just wants to slot people into stages, and that's that. And that's generally the criticism, pretty much, is that's all that integral really seems to be doing.
Yeah. So this is probably the trickiest one, because I would say this does happen to a certain extent online, although as I've said, the online spaces feel almost inherently unhealthy. They bring out everybody's shadow, mine included, and people sort of go to town. But this isn't really what the community dialogue sounds like. If you spend time in the community, people are not, they talk about stages, but they're not fixated. So what I would say is the quadrants have long since emerged as the primary heart of integral theory, in the world and in application. I think the 4 quadrants are the most central integral framework, more so than stages. Stages is probably the second. That's the order, but I think that's very important because if you see things in a 4 quadrant context, you've already relaxed some of the problems with stages, because stages are generally just upper left or lower left, or that's how they're used. And so when you spread them out to a 4 quadrant context, for example, thinking about stages and economics, which is a really interesting topic, you've already started to complexify the dialogue in a good way. But an integral conversation between 2 experts will go to quadrants much more often than stages, unless stage talk is made intentional and explicit. Stages often stay in the background. And in a social milieu where integrals gather, there's so often discussion about stages, but it's typically speculative discussions and musings about what we do and do not know. So we might have a conversation about, is this such and such a spiritual teacher at this stage or that stage? And we might have a discussion about that, but it's not a heavy-handed thing where we're trying to put people down and everybody is lower than us because we're integral. It's often actually, who do you think is integral but isn't a part of us but represents the capacity? So it's often a much more supportive, upbeat discussion. And you do not hear people getting into pissing contests about, I'm a higher stage than you are. Let's say if they're arguing in the room or having a discussion. Yeah, I've just never seen that happen where people start to label themselves and other people. That's an aggressive move that happens on social media much more often. Unfortunately, because not many of these people who are more grounded in the theory and understand stages better, they're not showing up online because it typically devolves. And so people could get the impression, and it's understandable, that integral just focuses on stages, but it's a lot bigger than that when people really unfold the theory.
Yeah, stages are interesting. It's obviously one of the ways into the culture and the thinking around integral, and early attempts to deepen one's vision, logic, and sensitivity and relativism. They lead toward the recovery of an axis of depth and the need to coordinate that somehow with personal development and evolutionary history and phases of culture. And there's this interesting ongoing body of expert knowledge around unfolding cognitive complexity. So many people run into stages first, either as a sign of their own next step or as a danger that reminds them of pre-modern and modern hierarchies that legitimately have played a role in genocides and things like that. And to me, there's some kind of a shadow reciprocity between people who use stages to judge people and people who judge stages because they're judgmental. There's a kind of perverse twinning there. And the version of stages that you get, whether you like them or not, from a superficial introduction to them, tend to be narrow and not unfold many different dimensions or nuances into it, so that it can't really be deployed effectively or benevolently. What those people, whether they're for or against developmental stages, tend not to see are these other elements. Like you were saying, the quadrants, they don't see this. I think one of the most important things is the different developmental lines and different styles of development moving through these stages. When you see that aspect of it, a lot of the danger and the reductiveness of stages vanishes completely and is already accounted for by those aspects of the model. But for me personally, I think the most important thing is to appreciate and to communicate that these stages apply in a sense to style rather than content. I could speak all kinds of integral words in a pluralistic manner, and I could advocate for all kinds of progressive concerns in a way that's conformist and reactive and ultimately no different than a MAGA Trumpist. So you haven't really, to my mind, seen integral until you start to see it apart from the content, the formal content of the cultural artifacts that are being produced. And stages are like that as well. They pertain to the way people are, the depth and the richness of your being, no matter what you're talking about. And you can't classify someone just by the signifiers they're using, because once those are out there, anybody can use them in whatever style. So we need to really be attuned, I think, as a community and as an outward facing community, to this element of style, of the way people are being categorized rather than what they're talking about.
Yep. And that would be type. And so one way to say it is quadrants, lines, states, which we haven't talked about, and type serve as a check against the stage model. They problematize it, they complexify it. And when you have a stage model that's embedded in all of those, the other aqual concepts, then it defangs it to a great degree. It complexified it. It makes you think, well, am I, just that question, am I seeing a stage or am I seeing a type? Or am I seeing a stage or am I seeing a state? Those questions are super rich. They come up all the time in psychotherapy. I teach integral psychotherapy. This is my little on the ground, besides books, thing to contribute. People love the material. I always teach stages after quadrants, after a nice deep dive into quadrant thinking. Then you add the stages, and then I add states and types in that order. But yeah, the portions of the model check other portions.
I think the online environments typically have been tainted by this kind of, competitive stage languaging and jockeying for position. And so I think people could be forgiven for thinking, if that is representative of integral, then I don't really want part of that, because it's not a very healthy expression of it. But in my experience in integral gatherings, it very much mirrors yours, Mark, in that I hardly have ever encountered that kind of way of relating or thinking. Sometimes in some integral gatherings, you do have cases of ego where you have multiple people who are wanting to be the smartest person in the room. They're wanting to hold forth but even then, I actually haven't encountered that much either. Overall, there's been a lot of, I think, sensitivity to context, appreciation of each other, enthusiasm, curiosity, inquiry. And I think from early on, there have been, people, Zach Stein and others, who have encouraged reflexivity around stage language from very early on, and asked us to really think about growth to goodness fallacies and to take a pretty nuanced perspective on it. And I think, a great deal is missed if you're only looking at what happens on a few forums. That's just not representative of the conversation.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that's important. People like Zach Stein, his developmental mentor, Theo Dawson, Suzanne Cook-Greuter, who was present in all these integral community gatherings, would offer basically a self-critique of ego theory. So a lot of the critiques that seem new to other people were coming at us in this earliest period of the diaspora of the decentralization, and we were hearing all about them. And Ken, bless his heart, just does not deal with his critics anymore. He used to when he was younger. People forget, but he stopped. And so we started, Zach was sort of like both an insider to integral himself, because he knew the theory and he respected Ken, but he had a whole, other world of developmental perspectives to offer up. And the one thing I would say and add, and then maybe both of you can close, is one of the problems with social media is you're dialoguing with zero context except this little itty bitty picture and a name of somebody you don't know. And I think what that generates is the desire to set the context, to have some discussion. And because of that, because it's so decontextualized, the urge to put people in boxes becomes hypertrophied, for lack of a better word. And this is what I would say, not even just talking about integral forums, but if you head to a forum to discuss gender issues, I mean, you're 3 posts in and it's a firefight. It's people labeling with each other. And if it's about politics, if it's right versus left, Trump versus Hillary, or whatever it is, it's a firefight. I will say, though, it's good to remind oneself, Integral does have a lot of lefties in it. Most people wanted to vote for Bernie or voted for Bernie. I don't think I mentioned that yet, but it's an important little snippet. Integral is not right of center in most cases, only in some. It's largely left of center. So anyway, I'll pause there.
Yeah, we would expect, if we look at something like integral politics, you would expect that it builds on from progressive politics, that it's been able to incorporate even that, but also that it brings in a sensitivity and an appreciation for both traditionalism and for the conservative or right-wing element of any kind of worldview. So that's what I would be looking at. We'd probably be mostly lefties, but with an appreciation for the right. That's what you would find predominating in integral political discourse.
Yeah, nobody does, or nobody would get kicked out of the room, canceled for representing a small c conservative viewpoint. People would be thinking this has got to be in there somewhere. It's part of the picture. So I've never seen that kind of firefight in person either, where somebody is, and I've taken some rightward positions, or in the gender discussion, and people get upset, but they don't accuse you of being the devil. I guess I would say. Bruce, any closing thoughts?
Well, just before we, I'll touch on a couple of things, and we'll see if we want to close or not, because I want to be respectful of Mark's time. I appreciated that he was problematizing the online space, as all of us have been doing here, right? It's because there's a kind of ethic about online interaction that we know we need to evolve as a species, and because we're just starting that enterprise, we're not very good at. It's important to remember the humanity of the people you're dealing with, and to understand what a narrow slice of them you're getting, and to try to assume that they have good intentions and that they're saying something reasonable, that there's a perspective to integrate there, and also that the dominant posts don't represent anything. Like we need to use these new digital media, but we shouldn't assume they're representative of communities or realities. There's 2 other issues that I think come up around integral. One is scandals. People are really interested a little bit salaciously in what was going on. Was there weird sexuality? Were there predatory spiritual teachers? That's very intriguing. It might be misleading, but I think defensively pushing back against it makes people extra curious and judgmental. And the other question is, what's the future? Like, I mean, at the What the Future conference, I sat up front and I cried at Terry's obituary, and I thought, boy, that guy's still out ahead of us in some ways. So I'd be curious what you think the future is, but I don't know if we have time to get into those questions or not, or what Bruce might want to say here at the end.
We probably don't. I think the question of what the future is coming, and it will not be that long. I think within the next year or 2, based on conversations I've had, there will be new information about where integral is headed in the future, and it'll be more cohesive, let's say. And then the scandal piece, okay, integral's had its share of scandals, is really its own podcast, and it's complicated. In part, in my observation, every single organization I can think of has a scandal. We're seeing scandals constantly. So is integral different? But it's also to get into the granularity of the specific scandals. People will say, well, Andrew Cohen and Mark Gaffney. And I would say these are two very, very different people with very, very different scandals or impacts on the community. And if we wrap them up, or Adida, let's say, as the originator, each one deserves its own conversation, because I think the actionable lessons are different in each circumstance. And at some point, if you guys wanted to have a dialogue about that, I'd be more than happy to talk in specifics about what I know. And I was around for some degree of all of those, although Adida was fading by the time I was joining Integral. He was fading somewhat from Ken's mind and from the community. But I think each of those things, yeah, there's a robust conversation to have.
I was going to say something when you were asking me what I wanted to add at the end, and that was one of the questions that I think is common, and I think that would be a good idea to take it up in a future podcast, is one of the criticisms that I've heard of Integral and why some people move away is the sequence of problematic endorsements. And they say it has turned Integral into too much of a hot potato. Nobody wants to hold it. If anyone digs deeply enough into it within an organization, they come across those scandals and figures, and then they want to distance themselves from the whole thing. So I think that is something that we do have to wrestle with, and I'm very interested in that. I'm also interested in furthering that conversation that Nomali started about what's the future for Integral. I think that's really on the edge for us. So maybe those are things that we can explore in the future. I would say overall, I'm hoping in this conversation, we don't give the impression that there's nothing to critique about the Integral movement. I don't think we've done that. I think overall, we've been pretty fair and balanced in the way that we've presented it. I think it's important to lay out all of the information that you've helped us walk through to really get a good, clear picture, so that when we do take up that task of critique and evaluation and looking for areas of improvement, it's informed by that bigger picture, which is often hampered because people have too narrow information sources and they get a distorted view. So I'm hoping this conversation can serve that end.
Yes, I second all that. I hope the defenses feel fair in the spirit of, let's say, a type of dialogical play. Like, I'm not expecting people to be, oh, he was 100% right about all of those things. I would prefer it generated dialogue for people who have questions and criticisms, but maybe have never heard the sort of insider's perspective about some of these criticisms of what's gone on in on the ground. And so that's my hope, is to offer some of those things up in the space, and people can then download that and add it to their repertoire of thinking about Integral to the extent that they think about Integral.
Yeah, let's do a follow-up on scandals. Maybe let's bring Nomali in. I think this has been really good because we're very open to critique. I'm very critical and I'm very open to critiques, and I fraternize with a lot of different communities. but I really appreciate your sense of motive coming in here, Mark, because I think it is important to say, hey, there was and is something awesome here. There's a lot of good ideas. There's a lot of good people. This thing is still functioning for whatever its incompletions, for whatever its failures to already be the perfect thing. It's a lot of well-intentioned, really smart, really deep people trying to get together around ideas that are very sophisticated to do the best they can for the world and themselves and the people they care about. And that's a thing to endorse, right? There's something I care about very deeply in all this, and I appreciate you standing for that.
I appreciate that. Thank you, and very well said. And I would be remiss not to mention your half sweater Christmassy and Christmassy Ganesha in the background. I think that deserves just a moment of attention.
Thank you. For anyone who's just listening to this on the audio.
Yeah, there's lots of green and red in Layman's picture. All right, you two, I have to transition. Thank you guys for being flexible on the time. I really appreciate it. And yes, until the next time.
All right. Cheers, Mark. Thanks very much.
All right. Take care, Layman. Take care, Bruce.
Take care.